Greetings, everyone. My name is Kevin Van D. I want to welcome everyone here on behalf of the Institute of World Affairs and myself. Before I start, I want to inform you about some of the things that are going to happen later on today. The first thing is at 3 p.m. there'll be a film right here in this room, and it's entitled Vietnam When the Night Comes. Excuse me. Then this film will also be discussing the effects of Vietnam's new economic policies. Later on at 8 p.m. there'll be a speaker, Joseph Collins, who will be talking on the Philippines after Marcos. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Mr. Don Luce. He received his Bachelor of Science from the University of Vermont on agricultural economics. He also received his master's degree from Cornell University on ag development. He's a very rich and diverse person, and he's spent much time in Vietnam over the last 30 years. I guess he's also just returned from a stay from that country during October. Mr. Luce is well known for his bringing to attention the tiger cage prisons of the Saigon government with the help of our own Senator Tom Harkin, who was at that time an aide to Congressman Neil Smith. He's also co-authored many books, and he's written and edited many books of poetry. Currently, he's also director of Asian Affairs at Washington, D.C. During the film this afternoon, Mr. Luce will be answering questions, and we'll also have his art display there that he has here currently. He wrote the script for this movie, and this was originated during a trip he took to Vietnam. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker. He's going to be talking on the Green Revolution and the multinationals of the Pacific. So I want you all to give Mr. Luce a warm welcome.
I want to spend most of the time on the Green Revolution, but before I do that, I'd like to do some advertising for the film at 3. I'm now on my way back from between Hanoi and Buffalo. This is my stopover on my way home, and I had lots of baggage of stuff from Vietnam, so I spread a little bit of it out. Over here, and you may want to just glance at this as you walk out, is a few items that I brought back for an exhibit that our organization, the Asia Resource Center, has on, we call it the plows swords into plowshares. Sorry, I'm still under jet lag. But we have about 200 or 300 different items ranging from the kinds of things you see here, which are mostly made out of recast brass shells, artillery shells. Most of these are from the war in Kampuchea or from the Chinese border, where Vietnam is still at war in both places. A lot of the other stuff comes from what we call the Vietnam War, what the Vietnamese call the American War, from back in those days, but it also goes back to World War II with, for example, a tablecloth made out of a parachute that somebody dropped, in the Philippines and so on. And then on my left, I just hung up 3 or 4 block prints, which are now made into scrolls. When I was in Vietnam this time, I was staying in a small village where they have been making these block prints for over 1,000 years now. It's a skill that is passed from mother and father down to son and daughter and so on, down through the last 10 centuries. And some of these are new. Well, most of these are fairly old. It's also interesting, on the middle ones you can see the old Vietnamese script and so on. But anyway, if people are interested in Vietnam today, I would really urge you to come and see the film at 3 this afternoon. It was got one of the awards at the Houston International Film Festival, and we're real proud of it and hope you come. Now, switching to what I'm supposed to be talking about, the Green Revolution. My field, as it was said in the beginning, was agriculture. It's what I was trained in and grew up on a farm in Vermont. Went to Vietnam in 1958 on the 9th of November and stayed there for about 13 years until I was kicked out for going with your senator to Con Son Island and doing the expose on the tiger cages. At that time I was working with sweet potatoes back in 58, bringing about 30 varieties of sweet potatoes into Vietnam, testing them against the local varieties, and then doing extension work in the villages. Out of the concern, out of working with villagers in Vietnam, I've developed a real deep concern about the whole question of the Green Revolution. Many of Vietnam's scientists were trained, for example, at Los Baños in the Philippines, where the Ford Foundation and Rockefeller Foundation have worked for many, many years on the development of miracle varieties of rice. So I'm going to concentrate particularly on the Green Revolution and rice, and then go into multinationals and their connection to the Green Revolution, which I hope I can make. I want to begin with concerns about the Green Revolution, and then talk about how I think it could be used more effectively, and also talk about the multinational sort of effect from Green Revolution. My concern is basically this: the Green Revolution and most of the miracle varieties of crops have the advantage of producing much more than the traditional varieties if you use enough fertilizer, insecticide, and irrigation water. I put a very simple chart up here. I figured if I was at Iowa State, I should at least put some charts and graphs up. If you come from Cornell, you're always a bit intimidated by Iowa State's Department of Economics, Ag Economics. But anyway, just in very simple terms, if you look at traditional varieties of rice, and this is simplifying it, but basically, no matter how much you put in the way of inputs, you get about the same yield. In other words, they're not responsive to fertilizer or irrigation and so on. Miracle variety of rice, on the other hand, if you don't use the inputs, will produce almost nothing. If you use a lot of inputs, then you get a tremendous response and increase in yield. Now, if you have 100 hectares of land and the resources to buy the fertilizer, the insecticide, and the irrigation, then the miracle varieties of rice and other crops are great. The problem in Vietnam or Thailand or the Philippines or other developing countries is that if you are a small farmer, you can't afford the fertilizer and the irrigation and the insecticide. And so you go into debt, or you sell your farm to one of the the agribusiness corporations. It's almost that simple. One of the problems in the third world also is that the interest rates on money borrowed are so high that by the time you get your crop, you've already spent all your money on interest rates. Now, if you go to Thailand, for example, in the month of April, and you go to the train station there at about 5 o'clock in the morning, you will see them unloading children. I mean, it's almost that simple. There are what are called fishermen, and these are people who go into the northeast, which is the poorest part of Thailand, meet with families, and hire a daughter, usually a daughter, for a specific period of time, like 6 months or a year. The family needs the money, which they get, approximately $50, to survive, to keep the farm. The fisherman or fisherwoman, whatever you want to call this person, will collect maybe 6 or 8. They are brought to Bangkok and then are sold. The best-looking ones go to work in the bars or brothels. The, in quotes, the smartest ones go to work as domestic servants, and the strongest ones go to work in the factories, small factories, big factories, and so on. From the perspective of the small farmer in the Northeast, they really feel they have no alternative, because the price of rice, partly because of this kind of formula, is going down. They have to either produce more rice and sell it, which they really can't because they've gone into debt and they have to pay off their debt, so their kids end up in the cities. And this is where you get the multinational connection. 1 minute before I get to that, I just wanted to add one other complexity for the farmers, and that is that where you have an agribusiness, for example, a pineapple plantation, one of the other problems that this whole question of I don't know how you can say the agribusinessization, or whatever you want to call it, of agriculture has been that as you've got larger farms using more insecticides, the runoff from the insecticides goes into the irrigation water, which goes into the rice paddies, which kills the frogs and the fish, which are among the major sources of protein for the small farmers. So I argue that while the Green Revolution has been a tremendous boon to agribusiness and to wealthy farmers, it has been one of the major causes of the urbanization and the breakdown of the family farm in the third world. And you could also argue the same thing in the United States, but that's a different argument which I won't get into now. So all of this has become, I would argue, great for the multinational corporation, because it provides a cheap source of labor for the factories which are leaving the United States, and particularly did leave the United States, have gone to the third world and set up business. Now, from a multinational perspective, all of this is great. I mean, first of all, you look at it from a wage perspective. The average wage, say, in Thailand or Philippines and so on, particularly in the Philippines, would at best be like $100 a month. The best you could do in the United States is probably $1,000 a month for factory workers. So if you take a small factory of 1,000 workers, what you're dealing with in terms of a labor cost is $100,000 a month in Thailand and $1 million a month in Des Moines. So you have a saving of $900,000 a month times 12. You're talking about $10 million a year for a small factory by moving it. You also have a lot of other side advantages in terms of sending your factory to the third world. For example, one of the problems that many factories face is the kinds of chemicals they can use. There are almost no laws against the misuse of chemicals in the third world. So that in the manufacturing process, you can use chemicals that are not legal in the United States. You can use them in the third world. Just a very simple example. This is a few years ago. I was in Kaohsiung, Taiwan, in one of the computer chip type factories. In the process, they have a special kind of wash that they have to use, using a sort of a chemical wash. Along the wall, they had several barrels of a chemical called chlorophane nu, NU, which I later, made by Dow Chemical, I later looked up in the U.S. and found that it's illegal for use in this country. So the factory can send it to Taiwan, and it's more efficient in terms of cleansing the equipment. At the same time, on the side of it, they had in English, for workers who didn't read English, but it was written, caution, fumes from this chemical, comma, if breathed, comma, may cause death, with no translation at all. So you have a big advantage in terms of the kinds of chemicals you can use in the third world. The second reason, or another reason, or third reason really, you've got the economic, the chemicals. The third reason, of course, is that strikes are illegal. And even if they weren't illegal, the families in the third world can't afford to take the risk of striking and losing their jobs. So you have an economic, you have a worker stability there that you wouldn't have here. So again, all of this is great for the multinational corporation, and it shows the real close connection between the miracle variety, the Green Revolution, and the modernization of agriculture, which is pushing people off from their farms, and the high profits of the multinational corporations, which are making use of the laborers when they get into the cities. I want to follow up in terms of what happens in this country as far as particularly poor Americans are concerned. I mean, the advantages to the corporations are obvious. What I argue we ought to deal with as a country is the disadvantages to the average American person. I mean, first of all, as we export our factories to the third world, we are exporting our jobs. I mean, it's obvious. If a textile factory leaves New England, 1,000 jobs are lost in New England and sent abroad. The second problem, which is a growing problem in the United States, is that as a country, we are destroying our tax base. Because each time one of these corporations leaves the U.S., a major part of our tax base is sent abroad. And so that we have less money for education and roads and that sort of thing. It is also one of the major contributing factors to our national debt. The third problem that it is causing us, and particularly in terms of our taxes and in terms of international stability, is that in order to protect the multinationals, the U.S. ends up protecting the dictators that support the policies that I've been talking about. It is, I would argue, the reason why the U.S. ended up in supporting Marcos for so many years, is that he made it possible for the multinationals to, year after year after year, both force farm people off from their lands and to imprison labor leaders who were protesting bad working conditions in the Philippines. So our support of dictators abroad, again, is a major drain in terms of our defense budget and in terms of the military contributions that we send to dictators abroad. I want to switch gears now for a minute, and then in a couple of minutes sort of open it up for your frustrations or angers at what I'm saying, and a chance to express your own views. But I wanted to just take a couple minutes to talk about what I would argue would be a much better approach, first in terms of the Green Revolution, and secondly in terms of multinationals. When I was studying agriculture, the major emphasis of the extension department at Cornell and at the University of Vermont was, and I suspect it's been the same at Iowa State, was that if you help the best farmer, the poorer farmers will see your ideas and adopt them. I mean, this has not worked and never will. But that has been the philosophy of agricultural colleges ever since the land-grant college system was developed. I would argue that rather than developing this kind of a curve, that what we ought to do is to put an emphasis on something like this. Putting that in much more concrete terms, in my own area, sweet potatoes, it means rather than, well, the sweet potatoes aren't a very good example because of the difficulties of hybridization and so on, which is the Green Revolution. But if you take rice, for example, rather than developing the hybrid varieties of rice, this is one other problem, by the way, for small farmers, is that most small farmers save their seed and plant it year after year after year. Well, if you do that with the miracle varieties, in almost all cases, your production goes down, 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 down over the years. If you use traditional varieties, then, and particularly the farmers will select the better looking ears of corn and so on, then your production will at least stay level. What I would argue is, instead of developing and putting your emphasis on the hybrid or miracle varieties, we ought to, as agriculturalists, work with the traditional varieties and find and use local practices of the poorer farmers and try to lift your curve up in perhaps a smaller amount, but what you're doing is helping the smaller farmer. You're giving more stability to the family farm, and you're making it possible for them to continue to make a living on a small farm. Now, if your money comes from the corporations, you're going to run into problems in doing that. And I think that's been one of the problems of agricultural research and so on, is that so much of the money and so much of the power at government levels and university levels comes out of the corporations. But if your concern is the family farm, if your concern is the poorest people, then you ought to begin to concentrate on improving methods and varieties for the small farmer. And you can do it with probably even less resources than in the development of miracle varieties. The second thing I wanted to say in terms of the multinationals and in terms of our own country is we ought to develop as a country regulations and laws that would state very simply, first of all, that products that are banned in the United States cannot be exported to other countries. I remember, this is going back to the late 1960s, working with refugees in Vietnam and being asked to distribute a diet soda to Vietnamese refugees who were starving. And I remember the argument that, I was saying, this is not going to do them any good. And the AID advisor was saying, well, it's not going to do them any harm. And I was saying, well, it's not going to do them any good. And it was like two 5-year-old kids arguing. And finally, he said, well, it'll give them something to do with their time and they'll like it. But if you look at that from the corporation perspective, this was a diet drink that had been banned because of cyclamates, the corporation was able to get a major tax write-off by making a donation for Vietnam. Now that may be an extreme example, but it's a real example, and it's what happens over and over and over. That in Thailand, for example, Depo-Provera, which is a birth control injection that's been banned in this country, is distributed as a birth control measure in Thailand. And in the early years before it became publicized, women who agreed to get the shots of Depo-Provera would get a free chicken. And the women who were very poor would come back and get them, very often because they needed, if you have a choice between a chicken for your family today and possible cancer in 15 years versus no chicken for your family and you're hungry, you probably go for the chicken and take your chance. So I argue that if products are not good enough to be used in this country, we shouldn't export them to the third world. And certainly that those laws could be made. Some of those laws exist, but we've got to do a lot more work on making sure that they're carried out. Second thing is, I would argue that as a country, we should develop laws, and very strict laws, that put limitations on imports, such as the United States would not import cloth made by children, for example, under 8 years old or under 10 years old. But let's make some regulations so that we as a country don't end up in that kind of exploitation, of people in the third world. I have one other point, and I lost here are my glasses. Well, that's basically what I wanted to throw out, and I'd like to now see if there are questions, disagreements, ideas. Yes?
On the last point, you said the United States can ban, for example, imports of clothes that were produced in an immoral way or something like that.
Yeah, basically.
But how are you going to monitor these things without greater intervention in the smaller countries?
Well, one of the questions, in terms of, interfering in the internal affairs of another country. First of all, when Van Heusen shirts goes to Thailand, that is a kind of interference, and follows practices such as use of say 8-year-old children, in the manufacture of their shirts. That is an interference. When we support the Thai military in the arrest and imprisonment of Thai labor leaders, who are working for better working conditions, that is an interference. I would argue that if we didn't interfere militarily in the affairs of the third world, then workers in those countries would demand better working conditions, and you would not have the problem to the same degree that you have now. So that we are interfering, we have to deal with that. Then the question, the other part of the question is, sure, what you say is correct, that it does involve a certain kind of interference. I would argue that at least it's positive. The rich in Thailand are not going to be appreciative of that kind of interference because they're making money on the sale of those shirts. In the short run, it is going to be very hard for a lot of people. It raises a lot of the questions that are raised vis-a-vis South Africa, and how we deal with corporations that work in South Africa, for example. But I understand your point, and it's a difficult one. In the back.
What
you're proposing would require, in effect, quotas on production from a country that produces in ways we feel are not right. In the case of textiles produced by 8-year-olds, they could easily have one factory with 8-year-olds producing textiles for their own consumption or some other place, and ship us textiles made by adults, which wouldn't solve the problem unless you would say, unless reform your whole textile industry.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard another speaker tell us that quotas on imports of manufactured goods from the third world would be the worst thing that we could do regarding the environment, because those factories are providing employment for people which is desperately needed. Otherwise, they would go out and burn jungles in Brazil or destroy overgraze the Sahel, or all those environmental degrading things. How would you respond to that?
Well, and first of all, I think there's a lot of issues, that are coming up. I mean, all thrown together, but trying to sort out a couple of the issues. I mean, first of all, the point I forgot to make and would stress, in response to both of your questions, and that is that the first thing I think that the U.S. has to stop doing is to support dictators that are protecting the multinationals from their own people. I mean, I think this is particularly true, for example, in South Korea right now. So that the local people, are not able to form unions, effective labor unions, and are not able to form, to work for child labor laws, as an example. The second thing, that we have to, particularly in the agricultural world, have to deal with is the policies that the universities here and abroad have promoted, that have pushed for the agribusiness farms that have been pushing people off from their farms and into the cities where they serve as a cheap source of labor. And the third thing, though, that I argue is that you have to begin to develop in some way, and I'm not arguing for quotas, I'm saying that you don't buy goods that are produced below certain minimal standards. And I certainly agree with both of you that has a lot of problems, one of them being, what you said, that you'll have a factory that produces for export and another factory that produces for local consumption. Do you have a better idea?
I guess the statement is based on the premise that the factories are needed for employment, and perhaps, as you say, a better answer might be they aren't needed. The problem is the multinationals displacing peasants from their lands, so that they do go on to slash more jungles.
Yeah, and that the people, that we, going back to your point about interference in the affairs of other countries, and that is that the United States stop protecting the dictators that are imprisoning the labor leaders and, those kinds of questions. Yeah, in the gray.
The real reason that we interfere in other countries and have multinationals needing the protection of our military is to sustain the standard of living that people are accustomed to in this society. They want cheap cotton goods, they want cheap bananas, and so on. The way you get that is by exploiting labor. Otherwise, people have to pay a higher price, and that means ultimately lower profits for corporations and lower standard of living for people here.
Well, there's a lot to that. I don't know what the figures are now. It used to be that we were 6% of the world's population and used half of the world's resources. I'm not sure the exact figure. The problem with that argument is that it doesn't separate out between the corporation owners and their levels and standards of living and the poorer people in this country. What I'm arguing is that our present system, you know, the export of our multinational factories and that sort of thing is good for the owners of those corporations and probably for a lot of the stockholders who get a lot of, you know, who do live by clipping. At the same time, that is one of the major problems for our country in terms of employment, our tax base, and in terms of our economics, our whole economy. One of the problems that our country has not dealt with is an economy that is destroying itself. We are not retooling our factories because we're sending them abroad. We are developing an incredibly big international debt because, again, our factories and our base has been exported. So I think the problem that you're referring to really is that the people who make the decisions for this country and probably for the world are the ones who own the multinationals, and that they're making the decisions on the basis of what is good for the upper 30% of people in income and not good for the bottom 70%. You know, and if you want 2 houses and a yacht, you know, and all the other resources involved in that, you know, then you should start, you know, criticizing me, and not me, but, well, yeah, if you want to, the ideas and so on that I'm putting forth, because it is not in the best interest of corporate America to rethink those policies. Yeah, in the red.
You are describing an interlocking system. You use the term system. And yet, toward the end of your talk, you spoke of particular actions which may be seen as fairly minimal. Now, is your view that the system can be changed through these small actions, like passing these laws that you mentioned, or are you really calling for a political economic revolution in the United States and at Iowa State University?
I don't know whether I'm calling for that or not. I'd like to see it happen. If you can make the call, you know, I'll certainly be right there behind you. No, I in a way I'm asking for both. I mean, I guess I'm saying that you have to first of all, you have to begin to talk about these issues. You have to begin to think them through. You have to begin at Iowa State if that's where you're at, because Iowa State is, for example, in the field of agriculture. Iowa State is considered, if not the best, it's certainly one of the top 2 or 3 agricultural colleges in the United States. And it could take leadership, and people would listen. So, you know, I would say begin here, and you know, and then if you can make the bigger revolution, you know, I'm right there. But while the things that I've been talking about, you know, changing some laws, beginning to change our philosophy about research and so on, you know, I may have made them sound pretty simple, but, you know, we all know that they are very difficult changes to bring about because it's things we have lived with for a couple centuries now. Yeah.
What is the problem like in Washington? Like, you know, I think, am I correct in also saying that our tax money subsidizing Indonesia to buy our DDTs that was sitting around regularly buy? Am I correct in saying that our tax money subsidized Indonesian government to buy up our DDT that's been sitting around, pulled off the market here, over there to be used in that country? Am I correct in saying that went on in 1986?
Probably are. Yeah. I mean, I don't know enough about it to really.
Why is it in government that is there no ethics at all? Is it like you saying to the U.S., you know, I'm asking, how does this really happen?
Well, I mean,
I'm one person out here, and I travel all over, and I live in Malaysia, and I see this stuff going on. I'm saying, how does it happen? Why is it no one cares? Is it like you saying, why do these starving people need diet soda with cyclamates and no one listens? Because you're one body in a million? Is it that no one's speaking up? Or is it that the few that are don't have any power? How does this go on?
Well,
How does this happen? What's wrong with Washington DC? What does one person do? Is there no agency that I can keep an eye on and say, watch this, watch that? What do I do out here? Where do I go to?
yeah, I mean, well, we both know that, I mean, a big part of the problem, and I'm trying to simplify this all into a two-sentence answer, but that the problem is that the people who own the corporations are the people who run the country. You know, in our country, if you look at people who are, for example, in all of the top slots in government, and it's a yo-yo system between the corporation and the Secretary of Commerce or Secretary of Defense and so on. They go back and forth between the corporations and, you know, back and forth. If you talk about the elections, you know, that were held yesterday, and I don't want to do that, but if you do, then you deal with the fact that that substance had very little to do with the way America voted. You know, it was how much money you had to buy advertising, you know, and how willing you were to be nasty. You know, and that it was advertising, and it was the boob tube, and that's a much deeper problem. And I think, again, if we can put this right down to Iowa State and the university system, we have to recognize that it is not the people who didn't go beyond the 8th grade or high school who are exploiting the world. It is the graduates of the universities that are exploiting the world. You know, and that one of the problems of universities, if you get back to his comments, one of the problems of Iowa State and Cornell and all the other universities is that the universities have been completely ineffective in putting across the idea that part of education should be the development of a more moral citizen. I mean, do the universities care about the morality of their students, or is the concern the development of someone who will get a higher salary because that is what attracts people to the universities and that is what attracts grants to the universities? I think we're running into a problem right now that we're moving from a very specific thing, the Green Revolution and the multinationals, into a bigger problem, you know, of our nation, you know, of how is our nation run, how are decisions made, and so on. And I again go back to the very specific thing of the Green Revolution and the agricultural colleges, of research that is developed towards helping the very rich and developing a kind of neo-slave, you know, of a poorer class of people who will support the level of living that the guy over there was talking about. I mean, sure, as a country, we want the 2 cars and the yacht and the 2 houses and all of that. And in order for the people who have those to afford them, they have to maintain the system. And they have been effective in convincing the poorest people that we shouldn't change this system because there's always the hope that they're going to break through and get the yacht. Does anybody have a last real positive question that, yes?
What should we do in Washington DC?
No, you can't lobby because then you lose your 501c3, which is your tax-exempt status and your ability to operate. So no PVO, private voluntary organization, would ever say that they lobbied, especially when it was being recorded. No, we don't lobby. The group I work with, the Asia Resource Center, basically is trying to to challenge the exploitation of people in Asia. I mean, we stick specifically to Asia. We've worked a great deal upon Indochina. I mean, most of us in our group got started in protesting the war in Vietnam, feel that the same kinds of things are happening in the Philippines, in Korea, in Indonesia, and so on, and that we as a country, have the responsibility to try to think these things through and try to make some changes. We put a lot of emphasis on trying to get across the idea that people in Asia are people, not statistics or slants or gooks or anything like that. So we have, for example, an exhibit of Vietnamese block prints, a folk art in Vietnam. We try to show the difference between, for example, with the recycled war material, what we're really trying to do is get people to think about the difference between the technology of the people who were dropping the bombs and the technology of the people on whom the bombs were dropped. And if you look at this and you think about, the kind of technology that was used in the Vietnam War and that we're giving to the governments in Indonesia or to South Korea or Thailand, and then you think about the technology of the people who live in the villages, who are making the wash basins out of the